Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming this evening. Welcome to Lancaster Psychology Research Showcase. Tonight we have Dr. Kate Slade taking you on an exciting trip down the ear canal to talk to you about the neuroscience of hearing. We have a few housekeeping things to go through first. So Kate, if you could put the first slide up. So we have a 30-minute talk, and this will then be followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. Obviously, this is a live event, so if we do have any technical glitches, please just bear with us, but hopefully everything goes smoothly. Feel free to post your questions to the Q&A box as you're listening to the talk. And you can do this at any point during the session by clicking on the icon. We will publish the questions as they come in, and if you see any questions you like to look up and would like to hear an answer to, please do give them a thumbs up, because then we know which questions to prioritise at the end, and we'll try and get through as many of your questions as we can do. Just finally, if you want to turn on the subtitles, you can click on the CC button, but do note that we don't have any control over the subtitles. These are just automatically generated by Microsoft. Okay, so I will now hand you over to Kate.
Thanks, Bryony. I am Kate. I am a postdoctoral research associate in the Neuroscience of Speech and Action Lab at Lancaster University in the Psychology Department. In our lab, we're basically interested in understanding how the brain works during communication, during speech and hearing, and what the impact of age-related changes or disease-related changes might have on how the brain works. So, pre-pandemic, our work focused on using neuroscientific methods, including electroencephalography and transcranial magnetic stimulation, to understand the neural underpinnings of speech and hearing. We're interested in how lots of different brain areas, like the auditory area, the motor area, work to support certain processes like speech understanding or communication when we're faced with hearing loss or different kind of hearing and language impairments. So in this talk today, I'm going to talk a bit about the sense of hearing, how it works, and we'll touch on what happens in the aging ear, so what happens to our hearing as we get older, a little bit about the relationship between hearing loss and cognitive function as we get older. And by cognitive function, I mean things like memory, being able to pay attention and thinking. And I'll also cover the types of neuroscientific methods we would have used in the lab to understand hearing better. I'll just mention that in the talk, there are a few audio clips that I'll play, and they might be loud. So if you're wearing headphones and watching, just be aware of that. I will say when I'm going to play them, but I just wanted to mention in case it was too loud for anyone. So firstly, what is hearing? Hearing is a really important sense, and it's very complex, and there are a lot of different parts of it that all work together that enable us to connect to the world around us, basically. It's functionally really important because it allows us to perceive dangers. For example, you can hear a car coming towards you or a fire alarm in your building. But moreover, it allows us to communicate with others. And it's a lot more complicated than just perceiving sound. We can recognize specific sounds in the environment, and we can say what they are. It allows us to separate sounds out. So if we're hearing lots of different noises all at once, we can focus in on a specific sound. So for example, if you're in a cafe or something and there's a lot of background noise, you can focus in on what a certain person is saying. And we can localize sound, so we can say where they're coming from. If you hear your phone ringing in another room, you can go and find it. And a lot of people make a kind of distinction between what is hearing and what is listening. So hearing is sometimes considered to be kind of like an unconscious, passive process, whereas listening is a more conscious deciphering of auditory information and possibly preparing to respond to it. So now I'm going to take you on this trip down the ear canal. Our first stop is going to be the outer ear. So to start off, the sounds in our environment are like invisible vibrations that we can't see. And hearing works by changing the sound waves in our environment from vibrations into electrical messages that our brains can understand. And because our brains communicate by sending electrical messages, the ear kind of needs to put in a bit of work first to convert the vibrations into a format that the brain can read and understand. So the first step, our first stop, is the outer ear, and that's basically the bit that you see when you look at a person. And it's shaped like a funnel to kind of like guide sound into the ear canal. So really, the part of the ear that we see is a really tiny part of the process of hearing, and a lot more exciting stuff happens down the ear canal. So stop number 2, the middle ear. So after the sound waves travel down the ear canal, they hit something called the eardrum, and the vibrations basically cause the eardrum to vibrate as well. And this kicks off a chain reaction. The eardrum causes 3 tiny bones in the middle ear to vibrate too, and these bones kind of amplify the vibrations, and they send them to a connected structure called the cochlea. The cochlea is like the curly purple thing you can see on the screen there. It looks a bit like a snail. It's filled with fluid, and tiny hair cells run all along the length of it, and this kind of leads us to the 3rd stop of our journey down the ear canal. So the 3rd stop is the inner ear, which is where the cochlea is. So the cochlea is a very interesting bit of engineering. It's tonotopically organized, which basically means organized by frequency. So different sound frequencies are perceived and recognized by specific cells at certain parts of the cochlea. These cells are little hair cells, which are pictured in the image on the right-hand side of the screen. So at the start of the cochlea, this is where high frequency sounds are received and recognized. So that sounds like bird song or somebody whistling or babies crying. Those are all high frequency. So I'll play a high frequency tone for you now so you can see what that would sound like. I hope that wasn't too loud. So that's where high frequency sounds are perceived. And at the other end of the cochlea, right in the middle, this is where low frequency sounds are perceived and decoded. Sounds like thunder, and I'll play a low frequency sound for you now. No. No. So when the sound vibration reaches the cochlea, it causes the tiny hair cells to move. These hair cells are attached to nerve fibers, and when they move, it generates an electrical signal, which is a type of message that is carried by the auditory nerve to the brain. So the next stop, we've arrived at the auditory pathway. So the auditory nerve carries the electrical message from the cochlea to the brainstem, and this is where a lot of the auditory information crosses over to the opposite side of the brain from the ear where it was processed. But some information is also processed on the same side. So what I'm saying is that the brain gets input from both ears. Both sides of the brain get input from both ears. So the signal travels to a structure in the midbrain and then onto the auditory cortex, which is the hearing center of the brain. And you can see the little electrical message traveling up in the diagram there. So the auditory cortex is found in the temporal lobe, and parts of it are kind of tucked away into the folds of the brain. The auditory cortex allows us to identify the characteristics of sound like pitch, rhythm, timing, location information, and the tonotopic organization, that organization by frequency, is preserved throughout the auditory pathway, even up until the auditory cortex. It's also important for comparing to stored information in the brain, and it lets us prioritize sounds over others. So we really need the brain to hear, and full perception of complex sounds involves lots of different brain areas, not just the auditory one. So the next thing I thought might be kind of fun and interesting is to share some auditory illusions and hearing tricks. Can we trust our ears to hear what we think they're supposed to hear? So this first auditory illusion, it was popular in like 2018. It was after the whole blue dress thing that came about, where people could see this dress in different colours. And it's basically a perceptually ambiguous stimulus that people can hear differently. So some people listen to this stimulus and they hear the word Yanni, some people listen to it and they hear the word laurel. So I'm going to play it for you a couple of times now, and you can have a little listen and see what you hear.
Laurel, laurel, laurel.
So, I mean, some of you might be thinking you definitely heard Yanni and there's no way that that's laurel. Some of you are thinking the opposite, and some of you might have heard like a strange combination of the two. And if you really focus on the word Yanni or focus on the word laurel, it might be able to change the sound you're actually perceiving. But why is this? Some researchers said that it was the quality of the recording. So it's not a very good quality, which leads to it being ambiguous. So our brains are kind of forced into making a choice to tell us what we heard. Our brains can't come back to us and say, we're not sure. So it has to make a decision. Also, it might be to do with the frequency information in the signal. So some people suggest that older people might be more likely to hear laurel because the sounds making up that word are of a lower frequency and easily perceived by older people than high frequency sounds. Also, how you hear it probably depends on your auditory equipment, like whether you're listening through headphones or through speakers, and the quality of that equipment. And also the effect of priming. So if you read the word Yanni first and that's what you were expecting to hear, that is probably what you did hear. So what I'm trying to say is sound maybe not as objective as we think. So I have a couple more of these things that I'll show you.
Laurel.
Oops, sorry about that. Okay, this is a really similar one. I saw it on Instagram actually, and it was shared via TikTok. And it's very similar to the previous one. And it's actually a clip from somebody reviewing a Ben 10 kids toy, and the toy makes a sound. But depending on the phrase that you read on the right-hand side of the screen, it kind of determines how you perceive the sound. So if you listen to the sound and read green needle, you'll hear it saying green needle. But if you listen to the same sound and read brainstorm, you'll hear the word brainstorm. So I'll play it, and if you have a look at these different phrases and just see how you perceive the sound. So the audio is always the same, but based on what you read, you perceive it differently. And that's because we're priming our brains to expect certain sound patterns that match a particular word or phrase. And when we're faced with this acoustic signal that is ambiguous because it's low quality or noisy, our brain makes a choice and it combines what we heard with what we expected to hear, and that influences our perception. So the final one I'll show you is very well known. It's called the McGurk effect, and it's another perceptual illusion based on auditory visual integration. So there was this experiment where people were required to listen to a speech sound, and the sound was bar, but the speech sound was played at the same time as a video of somebody articulating a word. Sometimes the person was articulating bar as well, so miming bar, and other times they were articulating dar. But the audio that was dubbed onto the video was always bar. But when participants saw the person articulating dar, they were more likely to believe that the audio stimulus was also dar, even though it was always bar. So hopefully this video will help explain what I mean. So if you just watch it and have a little look at the different faces as you're listening, and hopefully you'll be able to feel the effects of this auditory visual integration.
Ba ba, 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 ba.
So basically, depending on which face you look at, it affects how you perceive that information. So we know now that auditory information can sometimes be ambiguous, and we can see that other brain areas might play a role in how we perceive sound, especially if the signal isn't clear in the first place. So sounds can be ambiguous if we're in environments with lots of background noise, like noisy cafes, or if we have some form of hearing disorder that affects how we perceive sound. So an important question for us to understand is, how do hearing impairments and hearing loss affect how our brains process sound? So our hearing systems are very susceptible to age-related changes that can impact on our ability to hear. Age-related hearing loss kind of comes for us all typically around the 5th decade of life, so when we're about 50 years old. And the prevalence of hearing loss increases as we get older. So around 42% of people aged 50 plus have hearing loss, and this increases to around 71% of people aged 70 plus. So what happens in the aging ear? So age-related hearing loss is typically characterized by poor ability to hear high-frequency sounds. And that's because of the tiny hair cells that line the cochlea that we talked about before. So these hair cells become damaged over time. The damage starts at the end of the cochlea that's responsible for the high-frequency sounds. So that's why we see the high-frequency hearing loss seen in aging. Eventually, the damage kind of extends all the way down the cochlea to the lower frequencies too. So the graph on the left is a hypothetical audiogram. An audiogram is something you would get if you went for a hearing test after they've tested your hearing. They present a lot of different frequency tones and you're asked to say whether you heard the tones or not. On the horizontal axis, we can see frequency. So it goes from 250 hertz all the way up to 8,000 hertz. And on the vertical axis, we can see hearing threshold in decibels, which is basically volume level. So if we look at the blue line on the graph, this is a hypothetical person aged 20. As you can see, it's a flat line. No matter what the frequency of the tone, this person is able to hear it at a low volume level. And it doesn't matter how high-pitched or low-pitched it is. If we have a look at the yellow line, a hypothetical person aged 50, we can see that it's kind of like veering off in like a downwards trajectory. This is because the high frequency sounds need to be presented at a higher volume for them to be perceived. Anything less than 15 decibels on an 8,000 hertz tone won't be heard by this person. And then if we look at the green line, we can see a similar pattern, but it's just worse because it's gotten worse with time. And these frequencies need to be even louder for them to be perceived. So what happens when the peripheral auditory system is damaged? So the peripheral hearing system, the inner ear, outer ear, it basically means that the electrical message that is processed and produced there that's sent to the brain is also damaged because there's parts of it that is missing. But what does this mean for how the brain processes it? What does it mean for the auditory cortex? So there's some evidence that suggests that auditory brain areas show changes in people with age-related hearing loss. These changes include changes to neurotransmission and reduced volume in these brain areas. But it's also important to note that some of these changes are also characteristic of aging. And it's important for us to disentangle what actually is aging effects on the brain and what is hearing loss effects on the brain. And does hearing loss and this reduced sensory input, reduced auditory input as a result of hearing loss exacerbate brain atrophy that is typical of aging? And how does this affect other brain areas that we know are involved in speech perception, because we've just learned about that? So there is also research that suggests other networks show age-related hearing loss changes. Researchers have found reduced volume in attentional brain networks. And they've also found increased connectivity between attentional networks and the auditory cortex. And these researchers thought that age-related hearing loss means that we have to put extra effort into our listening. And the brain has a limited resource capacity. So when we have to invest extra effort, it depletes these resources and it leads to increased activation of other brain networks to compensate. And this could theoretically lead to degeneration of these areas. Another interesting area that's been focused on in research is motor areas of the brain. There's evidence for neural compensation here too. So researchers have studied the articulatory-motor cortex, which is basically the part of the brain that's involved with the movement of our lips and our tongue during speech and articulation. Some studies using fMRI showed increased activation in older adults during speech and noise tasks. And they actually found that this increased activation was related to improved performance in speech and noise. So as we can see here, there's some evidence for neural compensation and upregulation across different brain areas. But changes to resource allocation might actually have knock-on effects for daily cognitive processes and function that are not just our hearing processes, if that makes sense. So age-related hearing loss is actually recognised as a potentially modifiable risk factor for dementia. And what that means is we can modify it by using hearing aids to reduce its impact and kind of protect us from developing age-related cognitive decline. But the mechanisms that underpin the relationship between hearing loss and cognition are not clear. And there's a lot of different hypotheses that have been suggested for this relationship. So one of the hypotheses suggests that there's no causal relationship between hearing loss and cognition. Neither hearing loss causes cognitive decline nor the other way around, but there's a common characteristic underlying both hearing loss and cognitive decline, which is aging. So this theory suggests that aging is associated with parallel changes in sensory and cognitive domains. So as we age, we get poorer eyesight, we get poorer hearing, our memory gets worse, and that these changes are underpinned by common neurodegenerative pathology, common aging. Basically, global biological aging affects global functioning in the brain. So there's some evidence for this in that brain changes such as grey matter volume decreases and decreases in cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that surrounds the brain, is seen in both aging and in hearing loss. So another kind of hypothesis is that it's not just due to common pathology, but there's actually a causal link between hearing loss and reduced cognitive function as we get older. So there's two kind of branches of this hypothesis. The first branch suggests that hearing loss leads to more effort for listening, and because of the brain's limited processing resources, it kind of places extra demand on these resources, leaving fewer available for other cognitive processes because they're kind of reallocated towards listening. So there are fewer left for our memory functioning or other kind of cognitive processes. And this theory suggests that with hearing aids, we can see some beneficial effects by reducing the effort needed for listening, and some studies have shown improvements to hearing and memory as a result of using hearing aids. A second branch of the causal hypothesis is really similar, but it places some emphasis on chronic long-term sensory deprivation. So if we have hearing loss, for a long time we have reduced auditory stimulation to our brain, reduced auditory input, and this leads to tangible changes to brain areas and functioning and reallocation that can affect our cognitive abilities. So they suggest that this can be a direct relationship, but also that different factors can exacerbate the relationship, basically. So it can be indirectly affected as well by some psychosocial and mental health variables, like ageism and stigma, reduced social interaction, depression, and loneliness. And it's important to note that many of these factors kind of feed off of one another. So studies show that hearing loss leads to loneliness and isolation and depression, but isolation and depression are also risks for cognitive decline. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can use different neuroscientific methods to understand auditory perception, to tell us how the brain works during speech perception after age-related hearing loss. so we can understand how it affects the brain and also how it affects these wider cognitive processes. It might shed some light on this relationship between hearing loss and cognitive function. There are lots of different methods that we can use to better understand brain function, but some of our lab favourites are transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, and others are electroencephalography, which is EEG. And you can see a nice picture of our lab here with all our gear. I miss it. So first, let's talk a little bit about TMS. What is it and how can we use it to understand brain function during listening? So TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, works by placing a magnetic coil on the top of the scalp. The coil emits a magnetic pulse when it's pressed, which creates a magnetic field around the coil, which then induces an electric current into the brain, which leads to depolarization or hyperpolarization of brain nerves, which causes them to be more or less excitable. So using single pulse TMS, we can deliver pulses to certain brain areas along the motor cortex. So the motor cortex, or the movement area of the brain, is kind of like a band across your head where you'd have an Alice band or a headband. And different parts of it correspond to different muscles on our body. So if we place the coil over, say, the hand area, we can deliver a magnetic pulse to this area and measure the amount of electrical activity in the associated muscle. So we can place little sensors on the muscle, which gives us an indicator, like an indirect measure of the neural excitability after the magnetic pulse. So as you can see here, there's a little red line diagram. There's a pulse and then there's a big peak, which kind of shows that increased electrical activity after we've delivered a pulse. And when we do this, we can actually see the hand move after it's happened, which is very, very cool. So I have a video of our PI on the One Show displaying how TMS works. In the video, Dr. Helen Nuttall, our PI, targets a person's motor cortex, specifically their hand area, using a technique called repetitive TMS, which introduces electrical noise into the brain area, which then prevents a person doing planned movements with their hand because the noise is in the hand area. So I thought we could watch this because it provides a really nice explanation of how TMS works, and you can actually visually see it happening, which is very cool.
Absolutely make that not function. So
Right.
the magnetic pulse will go through my skull into the cortex underneath. The neurons in that part of the brain will fire. Rather than me controlling them, the TMS is effectively controlling them, and then it's going to make me shake, basically.
Okay.
Which-
So you're going to hold your arm out like that. Go on, Jeff.
Which way is the arm going to go? It's not. I don't want to.
Well, we'll see.
Just that,
shall we?
okay.
If you'd like to restrain me, that's fine. I mean, you can try.
Okay, Helen, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so this is a TMS machine. I'm just going to place this coil on David's head, on his motor cortex, and just get lined up. And you'll hear some clicking noises, and they're the magnetic pulses. So if you'd like to start doing some action with your hand. Okay, you ready? Here goes. Let's do that again. You ready, David?
Yes.
Really?
And
And
you
you're really trying to move your arm then. It
No.
just...
I can't do it. The TMS has effectively taken over that part of my brain. It's not that it's making planned movements. It's like noise in the brain, right? So it's just there's confusion in that part of the brain. So that part that controls my hand is suddenly going, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. That's
So I think that's very cool, and it looks very interesting. Probably provides a nice explanation better than what I did. So I have another clip here on the next slide.
Yeah, thank you.
That is very similar, but this time Helen is targeting the speech brain area, introducing electrical noise into this area that then inhibits that person's ability to be able to produce planned speech. So the video starts with the lovely volunteer articulating some speech, and as Helen introduces this noise into the brain area, it becomes very difficult, almost impossible for the person to continue doing the planned speech.
Peter Piper, please,
There we go. So hopefully that gave a bit of a nice visual of how TMS works, because it can be hard to kind of understand and explain it without seeing it. So now let's move on to EEG. So we can actually use TMS in combination with EEG to disrupt functioning in certain brain areas, like in the speech motor areas, which are involved in our articulation during speech, to see how this affects other brain areas, like auditory areas. So EEG allows us to monitor electrical activity in the brain in response to certain stimuli. So we attach little sensors to the scalp which pick up electrical activity, and we can monitor that. So this kind of plan, this TMS with EEG, was a methodology we were planning to use in a study that we were running just before the pandemic happened. So as we mentioned before, there are lots of different brain areas that play a role in speech perception, and one of these is potentially the articulatory-motor cortex, the tongue-lip movement area. And there are two hypotheses for this auditory-motor relationship and compensation after age-related hearing loss. The first hypothesis is that there's an auditory-motor decline after age-related hearing loss. And there was a study using TMS and EEG in a very similar way that showed the excitability of the articulatory-motor cortex was reduced after age-related hearing loss, so that there's kind of less input to this area, and as such, there's not much activity there. But a contradictory hypothesis suggests that there's motor compensation after age-related hearing loss, which is what we spoke about before. So there's this same fMRI study that shows increased activation of speech motor areas in older adults during listening to speech and noise. So there's research that's needed to better understand the relationship between these areas of the brain. So our research was planning to use TMS to disrupt activity in the articulatory-motor cortex, which is involved in movement of lip and tongue control, and then measure the activity of this disruption in the auditory cortex using EEG, whilst people are listening to speech sounds. But we had a pandemic, and then unfortunately we weren't able to go into the lab. So I thought it might be nice to give a bit of insight of what we've been doing over the past year or so, now that we've not been able to go into the lab. So obviously at present we're not using TMS and EEG, so we had to kind of think outside the box. So we're going to be running a auditory motor integration study online to see if we can better understand how motor areas of the brain contribute to auditory perception after aging and hearing loss using just online behavioural tasks. So there's this really interesting study in 2019 by Stokes et al., who used a dual task paradigm to try and occupy speech motor resources during a listening task. They did this with younger, normal hearing adults, and they basically asked them to listen to speech and noise, and they were asked to select what they think they heard from options on the screen. So that was the basic listening task. And then in other conditions, they introduced a secondary task, a task that was supposed to occupy some of the brain's resources in the motor areas. So one of the conditions, they asked participants to do the listening task, but at the same time, we want you to open and close your jaw every second. This was supposed to introduce some noise or use up some of the resources in the motor area not relevant to resources for speech. And they also had another condition where they asked them to do the listening task, but at the same time to subvocally, so under their breath, rehearse the word the every second. So just mouth the word the whilst they were doing the listening task. And they called this articulatory motor suppression, so suppression of these resources because they're being consumed by doing this vocal rehearsal task. So in the study, they found a really small effect of this articulatory suppression on performance during the listening task, but this only was with younger, normal hearing adults. And we probably actually think that the role of the motor cortex, these resources, probably comes into play when people age and when they have hearing loss or hearing impairments. So what we're doing now is kind of trying to replicate this study online. They did it in person, we're doing it online with old adults, both with and without hearing impairments. I thought I'd talk a little bit about some other research we've been doing as well. We're very interested in the factors that might affect cognitive function and hearing ability over time, to understand how they might play a role in this hearing loss cognitive decline relationship. And we know that dementia risk is increased by various modifiable factors over the lifespan, like hearing loss and social isolation. And obviously COVID-19 has had such a massive impact on how we communicate, and it's made social interactions very complicated, and a lot of us have had have significantly reduced our interaction with other people. So what we've been doing over the last 12 months is we've been monitoring people's hearing ability and memory ability using online tasks to see how lack of social interaction has had an impact on their hearing and cognitive function. The research is ongoing, so we're still waiting for the data, but hopefully we will find something positive that's not been too bad. So before I finish, I thought I'd do a bit of a shameless plug, and you know, if you watched this talk and you thought it was interesting and you fancy taking part of it in any of our research projects, we're always looking for participants who might be eligible to participate in our online research. So if you are right-handed, aged 18 to 30, 60 to 85, you might be interested in taking part. Typically, our research involves completing online tasks, like listening tasks and kind of memory games, as well as different questionnaires. And if you think that might be something you're interested in, you can send me an email, or you can visit our website, the NOSA Lab, to have a little read about what we've got going on at the minute. So I think that's it. I hope I didn't talk for too long. And thank you so much for listening, and obviously thank you to my PI, Helen Nuttall, and Chris Black, and everyone in the NOSA Lab for supporting our research. And yeah, if you've got any questions, please ask them.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was a really fascinating talk. We've got plenty of time for questions, so if you do have any, please feel free to still post them in the Q&A. But we do have a couple already. So first question for you, Kate. Is it true that the earlier you start to use a hearing aid, the better, in the sense of slowing hearing loss or even preventing cognitive decline?
So yeah, it's really important to get your hearing checked and get a hearing aid if it's needed, because there is some evidence that suggests that use of hearing aids actually it kind of connects you again to the world around you. It makes listening less effortful. It allows us to communicate and immerse ourselves in social environments, whereas we might have been avoiding those if we didn't have our hearing aids, because maybe we feel embarrassed about asking people to repeat what they've said, or we just find it too overwhelming to be in these social environments where often they're noisy environments, like in a cafe or, socializing with friends. But getting hearing aids can really help with that. And there is evidence to suggest that there's a positive relationship between getting hearing aids and cognitive function, as well as hearing ability, of course. So yeah. I'm a hearing aid advocate.
So get your hearing aid.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question's come in asking, this is about TMS this time, so about transcranial magnetic stimulation. And the question is, how do you know whether you are targeting the right area of the brain?
It's a really good question. So there's a few different methods that we can use. So we kind of use this device that allows us to track where on the brain we're targeting. So what we can use is either a standard model of a head, so an MRI that's compiled over like 200 different images to create an average head model. And we can use a tracking device that allows us to point to points on a person's head, match them up with this average head model. And by doing this, we can track whereabouts we are on the head, so make sure it corresponds to these certain brain areas that we're interested in. Another option is to obtain the MRI from that person, and then we can feed this into the tracking software as well, which allows us to be a little bit more accurate with the brain areas that we are trying to target. But again, it involves a similar process. We set up points on the participant's head, match them up to the tracking software, and it allows us to correspond between the head that we have in front of us and the MRI or average head model on the tracking software. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's quite a complex process then, finding the right areas.
Yeah, and I guess it's a little bit, it can be ambiguous at times, but having the MRI of the person, like the map of their brain, can help a lot with the specific targeting of certain brain areas. We can also do it by actually seeing muscle responses. So you can use these MEPs that we spoke about, like the spike in activity, to tell us that we've definitely targeted the hand area if we see the electrical activity in the hand area. And we can do the same thing by being able to visibly see the hand move. So if that's kind of like a hotspot way of doing it, like you move around until you find the maximum amount of electrical activity, which tells you you've targeted that area.
So you're kind of watching people's responses to make sure that you've got the right area, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so I would imagine that there are some areas of the brain that are easier to use TMS on than others, and are there some areas that you can't target at all?
Yeah, so with TMS, we can only really be on the like surface level of the brain. We can't target structures really deep inside because it doesn't reach that far. It's only got a certain like, what's the word, length of its reach, basically. So we're looking for like cortex type areas that are not buried deep within. Yeah.
Thanks. Another question relating to hearing loss. Would you predict more people to end up with hearing loss as during the pandemic? Would you predict more people to end up with hearing loss as during the pandemic people are Zooming and using video calls and things like this? And can turn the volume up as much as they like?
That's another really, really interesting question. And it's something we're hoping to like find out by the research we've been doing over the past 12 months as well, because we really don't know what the effect of this will be on people's hearing ability. So we could assume that because we're getting, in one sense, we're getting potentially reduced auditory stimulation because we're not going out and socializing with people, which could theoretically lead to us like not using these brain areas, which could lead to them, being not used and then not trained and not exercised, if you will. But then on the other hand, I guess we're engaging in a different form of interaction. We're, like you say, using Zoom, maybe doing this even more often, or completely newly, we never did it before and now we're using Zoom all the time. And it's a different type of auditory input, and will be really interesting to see whether this has an effect on people's hearing ability. One of the questionnaires we've been asking people during our 12-month COVID study is what types of interaction they've been doing, whether they've been interacting socially, whether they've been using Zoom, or whether they've been like listening to different types of audiobooks, to kind of categorize whether they've been active listening, online, active listening in person, or passive listening to things, and whether this might have any relationship to their hearing ability. We're measuring their hearing ability using a questionnaire and also a speech and noise task online. It's a really interesting question, and I'll be really excited to see if there are any differences as a result of the pandemic and our changes to interaction. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I guess particularly for older people as well, who might not be so, who might not find it quite as easy to use all the more modern technologies like Zoom and video calling, might have a greater impact on them.
Oh, definitely. I think for a lot of people, we've had to kind of adapt so quickly to using different technologies, which has been great for us to, maintain our social connections, and it might actually have a positive effect because we've been able to maintain social interaction, which can protect us against cognitive decline and protect us against hearing loss. But in the same way, I'm sure it's been a real challenge for a lot of people who maybe didn't do that so much before and had to learn kind of new technologies and things. Yeah.
Another question going back to brains. Someone asked, are there any sex differences in the average brain model you use?
Oh, I'm not too sure actually in the average model that we use. I'm sure there are sex differences in the brain, but I think this one is compiled from both genders so that we can use it for both genders. Like I said before, it's probably better to have the individual's MRI instead of using the average head model.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's going to be more accurate if you're basing it on the individual person's brain.
Yeah, because we all have like little differences, like our fingerprints are all different, so our brains.
Going back to hearing loss and hearing aids, someone has asked, do people report being less lonely after taking up a hearing aid?
I don't know how much research there is in this area. I believe that there are a couple of different studies that have shown this relationship, that they reported, like self-reported, that they were engaging more socially and increasing social interactions. But I'm not actually sure how much has been done there. But again, that is one of the things that we'll be measuring during our study to see the types of how much people have been interacting using different questionnaires. So, I mean, theoretically, they should improve hearing aids because, hearing aids should improve hearing because they allow you to restore some of your perceptual ability, to allow you to go out and communicate again. Whereas maybe you wouldn't have done before you had your hearing aids. But I'm not sure how much research has actually been done in that area.
So kind of in relation to that, you talked a lot about hearing loss and how hearing aids can potentially help us and prevent cognitive decline. Is there anything else? Are there any other steps that people can take to potentially prevent age-related hearing loss or to improve our cognition as we age?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I would say that's really important is to kind of be aware of your hearing ability, and if you're noticing that you're having to like turn your TV up or things like that, or you're finding it hard to hear what certain people are saying, I would just get your hearing checked. You can actually do it online now. There's like online on the World Health Organization website, I think, and maybe even the NHS website has one too, like an online hearing test. It's not the same as going to your audiologist and having your hearing checked by your audiologist, but it can give you kind of a bit of insight into whether you do have any potential hearing problems. And then, going to get your hearing checked professionally and getting a hearing aid if you can do is something that can really help. But also, social interaction is quite a big one in that there's research that suggests if you immerse yourself in social environments, maintain connections with people, this can be like a protective factor against developing cognitive decline in older age. So another thing I would suggest is, making sure that you stay connected with people, especially during the pandemic when it's been very tough for a lot of people to try and have those video calls or, phone calls or whatever you can do, meet up in the park and things like that. Yeah.
So really, really important to keep those connections going.
Yeah, definitely keep you connected with what's going on.
So going back to TMS, I was going to ask, have you experienced it yourself? What does it feel like? Can you actually feel anything when you're having the coil put on your head?
That's a good question. I was really not nervous, but I just wasn't sure what to expect when I first tried TMS, because yes, I have, because I wanted to make sure that I knew what my participants would feel as well when I'm giving them TMS. I want to be able to, describe it accurately and things like that. And it's not painful. You can feel a slight tapping on your head from where the pulse is, from where the coil is. And you can feel your hand move. It kind of feels a bit like if you've ever hit the reflex point on your leg and it kind of jerks without you meaning to jerk it. It kind of feels like that when it's on your limbs. And sometimes when you have TMS, you can get the peripheral nerves of your face are stimulated as well, because it's quite close to your face. So you can kind of feel like tingling around your face, maybe some twitching. Some people get like twitching on their nose, but these are all normal side effects of the TMS. And they can be a bit uncomfortable, sometimes a little bit painful, and some people don't like to have it at all. But in my experience, it's not been painful. It's just been a little bit weird.
Strange feeling.
Yeah.
Another question about the effects of TMS. Someone's asked, in people with damage to Wernicke's area, would TMS potentially improve their symptoms due to interference, or would it cause more deterioration?
I'm not too sure. I guess it would depend on the type of TMS protocol that's introduced into the area. So there are facilitatory protocols and inhibitory protocols. So protocols that would inhibit brain activity, theoretically, or protocols that should increase brain activity. But all of it is kind of introducing certain types of noise. So I guess the effects on certain brain areas would depend on the type of protocol that you introduce into the area. Yeah.
Okay. And do you adjust the strength of the stimulation according to the individual?
Yes, yeah, we usually do that. We basically find what we call their motor threshold. So we use that kind of procedure that I spoke about before, by where we locate their motor area by monitoring the electrical activity in, for example, the hand, using those electrodes that are stuck to the hand, and also monitoring their visible twitching. And we basically adjust the intensity of the stimulation up until the point at which we see these, we see a certain pattern of electrical activity 50% of the time, and that's what we would call their motor threshold, and we would adjust it for each person depending on their individual threshold. And this is in line with like safety procedures for using TMS. Feels like such a long time ago that I've held a TMS coil. This is like I'm like reliving a past life or something talking about this. But
Long
yeah,
time ago since you're in the lab.
yeah, I feel like I can't wait to get back in there and learn more stuff about it.
And are there any after effects of using TMS?
There shouldn't be after effects. So with different protocols, like with single pulse TMS, it happens. The effects are not long lasting, so it's just for a single pulse and you get like a muscle twitch. For the different protocols, they have different lengths of lasting effects as per research guidance, but they would be just for whilst we're in the lab. When participants leave the lab, they shouldn't have any lasting effects of the TMS, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's generally a safe thing to use.
Yeah, and it's just a momentary and not permanent change to your brain activity.
Just check if there are any more questions coming in. So maybe just to wrap up, so it seems like really important work that you're doing, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what the wider implications of it are. What kind of impact are you expecting the findings from your research to have?
Well, we're hoping it can shed some light on how the brain changes as a function of age-related hearing loss, and to kind of shed light on this relationship between hearing loss and wider processes that the brain is responsible for, like cognitive processes, to kind of understand the neural underpinnings that underlie age-related hearing loss, that can help us understand how the brain changes and provide some information for why there might be this relationship between age-related hearing loss and changes to cognitive function, or if there's no relationship at all. So yeah, it's really about understanding the neural and psychological consequences, I guess, of hearing loss in older age.
Yeah, it's really, really important and interesting work. I think that's all the questions we have. So we can wrap it up there. Kate, if you wouldn't mind just, you have put the final slide up.
I'm on it.
You're ahead of the game. So just to say that next week we have another talk, this time from Professor John Towles, who's going to be talking about online fraud and the role of psychology in cyberspace. So do join us at the same time again at 7:30. And thank you very much again to Kate for a wonderful talk, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.